Hello and welcome to KamenRider Blackman. So, for today's discussion video, we'll be talking about multiple villain factions in Tokusatsu. Now, this could pertain to Sentai, Rider, or just whatever shows in general because I have plenty of examples lined up. So, with multiple villain groups in one show, what benefits could come from that? In all honesty, depending on how it's done, either one group comes after another, or they're two active at the same time. There's plenty of opportunity there to expand or advance your story, especially going down to the characters, because in Tokusatsu with villains, they could either make or break a show. And I think a big example of what I just said would be in Super 1, where first there's the Dogma Kingdom, and then after them there's Jin Dogma. And so, they're both obviously related since Jin Dogma is a much higher part of the Dogma Kingdom. But in my opinion, while I'm not a big fan of Super 1, Jin Dogma were better villains, if only because, one, there was more than just two of them, and two, honestly, there's more, I wouldn't say there's more variety, but I would say that a couple of plans that they had going on were kind of scary. Like, honest to God, the second episode after Jin Dogma came in, they had a magnet monster bring down airplanes to crash to the ground. And heck, there was even another monster who was controlling people that were holding umbrellas. And then the umbrellas also acted as guns. Like, Jin Dogma had some scary plans. And for their characters, they did have personality, but they were all archetypes. But compared to Terra Macro and General McGirl, they at least had something going on. With Terra Macro, on the other hand, he was just an unimpressive villain. He never did anything until his last episode. And General McGirl was just same thing. He barely did anything himself, just sent out monsters. But with Jin Dogma, there's four of them, and Martial Demon, who again doesn't do anything until his last episode. But the four generals at least have personality, and you see a sense of camaraderie between them, especially when they all start getting killed one at a time. But for how multiple villain factions are done, as I did say before, with shows, how they structure them, now, there could be one villain group that begins the show, and then they could be defeated still early on, not with no particular number in mind, maybe say early 20s or still somewhere in the 10s. The first villain group could be defeated right there and then afterwards, another villain group could come in and take over. And honest to God, the best example of how to handle multiple villain factions is Gosager. Because first there are the War Stars, then there's the Yumaju, and then there's the robots. I forgot the name of their group. I think it's the the robots. I forgot the name of their group, but them. It's those three groups, and what ties them all together is Brescia, because Brescia was the one who originally sealed the Yumaju. He was also he was the one who called down the War Stars, and he just so happened to stumble upon the robots. But you get what I mean. Why multiple villain factions worked perfectly in Gosager is that while they all came one after the other, there was always that one thing that tied them all together, having them be connected, and that was with Bodegia, with how he manipulated all of them to serve a purpose, and just with how to handle multiple villain factions. I think Goseiger is honestly that high standard. But for other ways for how they can be done, two examples that come to mind to me are 01 and Bokenger. Because, well, first with Bokenger, we have our protagonists, and our antagonists are the Gotham civilization with Gaja and Ryuan from the Jadu tribe. Then there's Dark Shadow and the Questers. Like I said, and those are our antagonists, and our only protagonists are the Bokengers. But while it is good versus evil, it's not like they are all trying to take over the world, but they're not. But obviously, in a regular show with like a good versus evil, they're all just not going to take turns, because Bokenger is a treasure hunting show, and so it's kind of less of good versus evil, and it's all one big. Well, everyone's just treasure hunting. Everyone's hunting for precious. Everyone's after power. And then there are the Bokengers, who preserve precious to keep that power out of evil's hands. So that's why it works so well in Bokenger. Because, yeah, there are the protagonists and the antagonists, but everyone's literally just competing against each other. And it's pretty much that. And basically it's just last man. Words. I was going to say, fight down to the last man, basically. But with the other example, 01, with multiple villain factions happening like simultaneously, there's Metsubo Jinrai, Zaya, and much later Arc. But to throw in the competing mix too, there are our protagonists. But once again, with the villains, they all connect together because of one thing, Zaya, because Guy was the one who created the Arc, and which by proxy also created Metsubo Jinrai. But the point of 01 with all those characters isn't because everything was Guy's fault. The point of 01 was that the point of 01 was how to perceive Humagears, and we have all these conflicting stances on them. There's, with the good guys, Humagears should be treated like you and me and have equality. With Metsubo Jinrai, it's that Humagears should be the dominant species. And with Zaya, there's Humagears are worthless, just touching on robot racism. And then later there's Arc, who eventually just decides, I'm going to kill everyone. Yeah. But when you get towards the end of 01, it really highlights the show of there are all these conflicting stances on how to perceive this, I guess you could say, new species, and how should we perceive them as, and someone's going to be right and someone's going to be wrong, and so on. And in both those shows, they found an angle of how to do multiple villain factions. Like, you have your characters, and you have them form essentially their own ideologies and ideals. And we see them conflict and combat, and see them fight for those ideals, so that they can show others why they see how they see. basically having it like a big debate. And for other examples of how to handle multiple villain factions, another one that's actually quite nice, KamenRider / Jungle Fury. Since Jungle Fury basically did the same thing note for note. So, with our villains, I'm gonna say the villains' names from Jungle Fury because I remember them more. And it's also been a long time since I've seen KamenRider. So with KamenRider in mind, while I'm talking about Jungle Fury, there's Daishi and Camille, the Overlords, and later the Phantom Beasts. While they're all similar but still different, especially in backstories, they were like the Overlords and the Phantom Beasts were meant to serve a purpose pertaining back to Daishi, and that was Daishi wanted to take over the world and prove that he was the strongest. So first there were the Overlords, who were his teachers. Then later there were the Phantom Beasts, who wanted Daishi to be their king, all reaching from one point to another of I want to be the strongest, and now I can, and basically I will declare myself the strongest because now I'm just unstoppable. It's like they all serve a purpose. That's the big point. The villains were meant to serve a purpose in Jungle Fury, and they did. Even with individual villains and characters alone, they bothered to at least have depth to them. But the bigger... Sorry, I'm just looking down my notes. But the bigger, thing to have your attention throughout that whole thing is just Daishi and Camille. And so, I'm going to move on now to my bad examples before I lose my train of thought. To which there are only a few. For bad examples of how multiple villain factions are handled, for one thing, you gotta have direction. There was a direction to have with each of the examples I showed, and these bad ones didn't really follow a direction. And I'm going to start off with the first one coming to mind, Megaforce. So, with Power Rangers Megaforce, with how they adapted Ghost Sager, they missed a lot. With adapting Ghost Sager, Episode 1 and so on is the first arc with the War Star aliens. Then Creepox dies, and we now are including the mutants, and the War Star aliens are just going to take a back seat for the rest of the show, but they're still there. And then after the mutants are beaten, we're going to adapt the robots, but the War Stars, they're still there. Like, you get what I mean? It's like the War Star aliens take a back seat for literally until towards the end of the show, because they're the last group standing until the next season. And yeah, it's Barack basically doing all the work, but it misses completely how Barasia was doing it. Barack was basically working behind his boss's back, while Barasia was just manipulating everyone, and it worked better because, there was nothing. Barasia left nothing of Warstar once the Yumaju came, and then once he started working with the robots, there was nothing left of the Yumajus for Barasia to manipulate. Mind you, Barasia was also heavily injured before a couple of episodes before the Yumiju were defeated. But the point still stands. And once it was Barajia's turn to be the final boss, he left nothing left of the robots. Also, he could take over and said, okay, all y'all done, my turn. Varrock just said, Malcor's a fool. Malcor's a fool. And just started working with other people. Mind you, the goal of like the Warstar aliens was to take over Earth for the Armada, so you'd think they would have been considerate enough to have allies. Hell, the Warstar aliens were allies of the Armada, so why would they be against getting more help as long as it benefits them? There was just misdirection happening with Megaforce, which is why the handling of multiple villain factions there just bombed. Speaking of which, of mishandling of multiple villain factions too, totally similar to this, Saber. How is it done in Saber? There's the Megiddo, there's the Sword of Logos. Then later, Storius just does his own thing. But the weakest part about Saber was the Megiddo, because they were just so boring. Not only were the Megiddo just boring, but Caliber was there. He worked with them, but he was the most interesting, and most of his story took up the first arc of the show because it involved Kento and Toma. The Megiddo were there just to fight and create monsters. Then once the second arc comes around, the Megiddos just take a back seat because of the corruption within the Sword of Logos. And the Megiddo are just there. Then they die. Oh, no, they don't all die because Storius is still around because he's in cahoots with Isaac. Like, that's just, yeah, you get what I mean. Like, if you're going to have villains, like, if you're going to have more than one set of villains in your show, they both gotta be important. Like, one can't take a back seat so that the other could get more attention. Otherwise, you have characters that are just not interesting enough to pay attention to. And unfortunately, that's what happened in Saber. And the most we got out of the Megiddo was Storius, who again was in cahoots with Isaac. And with Storius at the end, it's just, it would be like Baragia, where now he's the final boss after all of his manipulating. But right off the bat first, Baragia was a more interesting character because he was hiding under a facade each time. Storius was the same, the exact same, and he just got darker. And it wasn't all that, it was just weak. And he was just weak. And so, that's another problem for multiple villain factions. If you're gonna have villains, then have your villains. Do like how Pokendra does it, and either each one takes turns with being the antagonist of the episode, or have both working together simultaneously. Like, have the villains form an alliance. Because when one group just doesn't matter throughout a majority of their show, what's the point of even having them? Next example, with Dawn Brothers, there's the Noto and the Juto. And while the Juto are interesting in concept with how they, take over people's appearances, why did they go about? Okay, to be fair, the connection between the Noto and the Juto were the Dawn family. They were species created by them. But the Noto at least wanted to keep their world flowing and just still fine and active. The Juto just came to our world, then acted like animals by going rawr. Oh yeah, and Kiji Brothers married to a Juto. That was possibly the most interesting storyline involving that group of villains. But for the most part, the Juto, they took too much of a back seat. And all of your attention was just more on the Noto because they were there every episode and were honestly more complex. Like, the Juto just come to our world just because they were a mistake that the Dawn family made and they couldn't control them. And in all honesty, we're kind of getting that idea now in King Oger, where the Bugnarok are taking... Well, the Bugnarok aren't taking a back seat. They're secondary and they're there. For what I mean in King Oger, there are two multiple villain factions there. There's Racules, if I'm saying that name right, the king from Red's kingdom, and the ancient monsters that the King Ogers are meant to fight, the Bugnarok. Now, Racules is the more, I guess, important villain to pay attention to because he's just evil, and from episode 1 had the goal of uniting all the kingdoms so that he can take over the world. But the Bugnarok are there because they're the evil monsters that have risen and want to destroy things. It's fine. It's good how King Oger does it here because, yeah, the Bugnarok are secondary, but they're not taking a back seat. They gave a reason as to why we have freaking powers and giant mechs because they're monsters, and this is Sentai. Now, Racules is just a villain on the political side, and it works nice here. Now, for how multiple villain factions is working in Geats, so far, all I can think of is that, okay, so for Geats, there's the Desire Grand Prix staff and the Jamato. The Jamato are the bigger threat right now, but the Desire Grand Prix is just shady because from the episode where Geats gets Boost Mark II, like one of the guys in charge, I don't know his name, says he basically says you have a particular power that I didn't expect you to have and you should be gotten rid of. He means that about Geats. But what is that pertaining to with them and how they're evil? I'm not too sure, but that's the thing about the Desire Grand Prix, at least the staff. They're not really evil. They're people doing a job. That's about it. Had Geats had already got what he wanted, or just lost already, then there wouldn't be no particular idea of a threat. But there's something there that the Desire Grand Prix are hiding, and we'll see what it is when we see it. But yeah, I do like it when there are multiple villain factions because there's something interesting to have, and there are more characters to focus on if I don't particularly like one group and would rather them be defeated, just so I can pay attention to these new villains. Like, they could be a step up and more complex. Once again, going back to Super One, like with Terra Macro, his goal was he wanted the perfect society. And with Martial Demon of Jin Dogma, he just wanted chaos. And he was willing to create the perfect society through the chaos. Same ideologies, but different execution. Dogma will pick and find what works for them. Jin Dogma will basically say, okay, you'll either work with us or you'll die. Well, not so much like that. More so like, we'll plunge what we need. Jin Dogma will basically be like, we'll plunge for what we need, and whatever we don't need, we'll kill it. Pretty much like that. But those are just my thoughts and opinions on multiple factions in Kamen Rider, in Sentai, and just Tokusatsu in general. My throat's out, and I gotta go see Thomas for a new video. But I gotta go see Thomas to film Dawn Brothers. Oh god, before I go, I'm gonna get a drink of water. Thank you all for watching. Please not forget to like, subscribe, share this video, tell your friends about KamenRider Blackman, and I will see you guys basically next Friday when I upload the Dawn Brothers review. See ya!